Hey, welcome to my Windows Azure talk of today. I am Ciprian Jichici. I own a consulting company named Genisoft, which is based in Romania, in the western part, in Timișoara. I'm also a member of the Microsoft Regional Directors Program for Romania. The topic for today, the title is quite extensive, building your mobile backbone with the Microsoft application platform. I'm going to focus my talk mostly on some architectural issues. I'm going to talk about how we can use the different components, the different platforms, the different technologies that make up the Microsoft application platform to build an infrastructure for mobile applications. Because I want to talk about the architectural issues and about some challenges that you might face when you start working in this area, I'm going to refrain from doing actual demos, and I'm going to focus most of the talk on the architecture. The talk is based on our previous experience with implementing a real-life solution. So I'm not going to talk in theory, but I'm going to try to talk as much as possible based on our existing experience, based on the things that we found out while building a real-life solution. Of course, a huge thanks to the sponsors of this conference. They are the ones that made everything possible. So the agenda for today's talk, I'm going to start a little bit with a description of the context, of the technical context, when it comes to build and to implement and to maintain back office services for mobile applications. I'm going to talk a little bit about the architectural challenges that today's enterprise architects will face when they want to implement solutions for the mobile space. And I'm going to refer to a real-life solution, to some real-life challenges, to some real-life experiences that we've had building such an infrastructure, such a solution for a large retail company. Actually for the customers of a large retail company. So let me start with the first part and talk a little bit about the context. If we think back like in the 1990s or in the 2000s, desktop operating systems were probably the thing to talk about. And then of course with the advent of data centers and more complex solutions, with the advent of Java, actually with the advent of Java Enterprise Edition, with the advent of .NET Framework, we've started to talk more and more about back-end solutions, about server-side solutions. Of course, we had the historical and sometimes philosophical debate about which one's better, .NET or Java. We had sides, we had a lot of talks and discussions about that. Now, the interesting thing is, I think in the last 7 to 8 years, there's been a major shift in the industry. And if we talk today, the thing to talk today about are mobile devices. And what people do not fully realize yet is that the substance of the talk is pretty much the same. It's the form we are delivering functionality that is different. But the substance is the same, and I will elaborate a little bit on this one later. Now, if we think about developing solutions in the mobile space, of course, we have a few important players. Some are big, some are bigger, some are smaller. But it all boils down from the point of view of the client side of things to 4 platforms. Right? And of course, I'm talking about the Windows Phone, I'm talking about iOS, I'm talking about Android, I'm talking about BlackBerry. The reality, however, is that from a technical point of view, this new world is pretty complicated, right? You have to take a lot of decisions on the client side that have a direct impact on your server-side architectures. And of course, we would all want to live. Sometimes I find myself thinking about those days when knowing one language, when knowing one technology would solve all your problems, both server-side and client-side. Well, guess what? Those days are gone, right? Today, if you want to produce, if you want to implement, if you want to deliver solutions that are tied to the mobile space, you have to deal with a lot of challenges. Now, why do I say that client-side decisions do have a significant impact on the server side? Let me give you one simple example, right? One functionality that you see probably in most applications, and that's push notifications, right? It would be a very interesting world, and it would be a very easy and simple world if there would be one generic provider of push notifications that everybody would use. The reality is that each and every platform has its own push notifications provider. If we talk about a Windows platform, there are actually different push notifications providers for Windows Phone and for Windows 8 devices. Now, if you want to send push notifications, which you most probably will do from a piece of code that resides on your server, on your data center, or on the server side of your solution, if you choose to do that in the cloud, you have to be prepared to do that by integrating at least 5 different technologies if you want to be truly cross-platform with your solution. And that's just one simple example. The other interesting discussion is, and I have that a lot with companies and customers I work with, they say, okay, just stick with one platform. Well, my question is that really possible today? Is that really feasible from a business perspective? I think not. So the next question is, and that is a question I got asked a lot, is what are the ingredients for the success of a mobile platform, server side and client side? Because people want to understand which is the safest one to bet on. And again, the answer here is very easy. There's not a single one that you can safely bet on today. Things shift with such a speed that if you try to bet on a single platform today, you might end up in 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now in a pretty awkward position. So my typical answer when it comes to the ingredients for success, I think there are 2 major ingredients for the success of any platform. It's clear for me that starting maybe from last year or from 2 years ago, the battle is not on hardware anymore. The battle for being the most successful platform is first of all fought in the field of apps. Who has the best apps will be probably positioned the best way. And what's interesting here is that I'm not talking only about the platform providers, like if Google has the best apps or if Microsoft has the best apps or whoever else has the best apps. It's also true for your own organizations, for your own customers. Take the example I'm going to talk about. Take the retail space. The ones that will have the most compelling apps in the mobile space will be the most successful on a mid and long-term range. I'm 100% assured about that. Now, apps are great, provided that the second ingredient is also there. And that second ingredient, of course, is services. I think that on the long term, the battle between the different mobile platforms will be fought not on the client, but it will be fought on the realm of services. And that's the realm of the server side of things. Whoever has the best services, the most complete services, the most scalable, the most robust services, will be the one that eventually will have significant gains in this particular area. Now, of course, when we start talking about the server-side services, the question is, how do we approach this? What are the platforms that we can use? What are the technologies that we can use to implement these services? I have my friend here from Microsoft, Zoli Herceg. I remember like 6, 7, 8 years ago, we were discussing a lot in many places with many people about SOA, right? About service-oriented architectures, right? That was the buzzword of the time. You are not cool if you were not doing SOA. No? This is a very interesting thing in the industry. From time to time, we see buzzwords that just pop up, and at that moment, if you are not doing the buzzword, you are not cool. Remember BI, right? If you are not doing BI, you are not cool. If you are not doing SOA, you are not cool. Today, if you're not doing mobile, you're not cool. Well, the difference is that today, if you're not doing mobile, it might be that tomorrow you won't have anything to do as an organization. And that's a little bit of a difference from the other cases, from the other situations. So let me talk a little bit about the architecture, the overall architecture of a mobile solution. And the first thing that people ask me always is, okay, great, so which are the building blocks that are needed? Where do we start from? How do we start to build? How do we approach the architecture of the solution in order to make it successful and in order to make it a viable solution? Now, remember, today, the game has significantly changed. Again, I remember, like maybe 10 years ago, when you would start a project, you were thinking like, okay, so this is going to be an 18-month project. So here are the requirements, here's the solution, here's the timeline, and so on. Today, if you deliver functionality in 18 months, you'd better forget it, right? Because today you have to deliver and you have to update functionality at a significantly faster pace than ever before. And from what it looks like, the pace is going only to increase. So today we're living in a completely different world. Now, if you ask me, there are two things that you need to do, right? It's simple. You know, people always ask Albert Einstein one question, probably most of the time, is, how did you do it? How did you do it to do all these things and to invent all these things and so on? The answer of Einstein was always, you know, there are two steps. The first step is you have to learn the rules of the game. Step number 2, you have to play the game better than everybody else, right? So it's an easy explanation, right? And my answer is also easy, right? There are two components for a successful solution. The first one is a great-looking client application, right? It has to have very interesting graphics, functionality, and so on. Step number 2 is, of course, a strong service backbone, right? So the answer is very easy. You have to have a great client application, and you have to have a great service backbone, right? Well, really? Really? If things were that easy, I think we would live in a much, much better world. Guess what? Things are not that easy. Actually, things are way, way more complicated. And let me give you some insights. of things that you might need to solve in order to build a successful solution. So let's think a little bit. Probably the first one that is asked from you, if you are a solution developer by your customer, if you are an IT department by your boss, is, dude, you have to be cross-platform. Say, okay, cross-platform, that's easy, right? But then you start thinking, okay, so cross-platforms means that we need to develop for Windows Phone and Windows 8, right? That's .NET. Check, we know .NET, that's good, right? Then you think, well, we also have to develop for Android. Well, that means probably Java. Yeah, okay, we might do that. And you think about, what if you want to develop for iOS? Oh, that's Objective-C, right? And all of a sudden you find yourself in 3 different directions. And then you have the little things, the ones that really kill your processes. It's like, what is the ILM solution we're going to use? The application lifecycle management solution we're going to use? How are we going to use Xcode? How are we going to use Eclipse? And how are we going to use Visual Studio? All at once. Preferably with a source control solution at the back end, which of course can be, I don't know, GitHub based or might be Team Foundation server or whatever. But when you multiply all the components, most probably you will start to get a little bit dizzy, right? Because of the implications. Let me give you another example. What about security? Of course, if you develop a simple application that only delivers content, that's easy, right? Because most probably there's going to be no security at all needed. All the content is public, right? But what if your solution will need support for authentication? What if your solution will need support for authorization? And here's things are starting to get really interesting, right? Because sometimes you might want to integrate with, I don't know, with the Facebook accounts. Sometimes you want to integrate with Active Directory accounts. Sometimes you want to integrate with Windows Live accounts, or how they are called now, Microsoft accounts, right? And so on. And again, when you start factoring all the different components, all the different requirements that you have for your back-end solution, the number of possibilities actually starts growing exponentially. And then we also have the example I gave you at the very beginning about push notifications, right? Push notifications is apparently a very simple concept. It's the concept of sending a message to a mobile device, right? And that mobile device receives the message and pops up, shows it some way, and then probably keeps it somewhere where you can look at it later, right? Easy? Well, not really. Think about what happens behind the scenes. Think about what happens until you are able to deliver that message to a specific device or to a specific set of devices. Your device has to register with what is usually a push notification center. And as I mentioned, the push notification center is different for each and every single operating system, right? Of course, we do have today solutions that sort of provide an indirection over the different notification centers. That's true, but at the heart of it, we're talking about different technologies. And then what you need to do yourself is you need to manage device identifiers. Because sometimes what you want to do is you don't want to send push notifications to everybody. You might want to send push notifications only to a certain group of customers, or only to a set of customers that fits a certain rule or a certain profile. And then you have to deal with the results of sending those notifications. So if you start thinking a little bit about it, like how are we going to implement this? Right? Take a very, very simple example. You have a Windows 8 application that runs on a Windows tablet, and then you have a server-side service. You've implemented it, say, with ASP.NET, MVC4, right? It's written in C#, everything is cool, everything is easy, right? You take a look at the documentation and you see the way you can integrate with the notification center for the Windows 8 platform, and it's pretty straightforward. It's rather easy. And then one day, your boss comes in and says, you know, there's been a decision. We also have to port this stuff to iOS. And then things start to be interesting. They start to be interesting from the UI experience and the UI implementation, all the way back to the way in which you've implemented your backend service. Because all of a sudden, you find out that the pattern that you have used, for instance, for the communication with your backend service, does not work that well with a completely different platform, like iOS. And I've seen that many, many, many times. You know, there's a certain inertia in the world of developers, of .NET developers, especially on the server side. People got used so much to a given pattern, for instance, SOAP-based and XML-based services, that they have a hard time letting go with that particular solution. And I've seen that endpoints written in a certain way, and then weeks or months consumed to make it compatible with a completely different client platform. So that's another thing to think about. And then, of course, on top of everything, there are the specific requirements that you find in most projects. A consistent application lifecycle management experience. Meaning, you probably want to end up with only one source code base. You probably want to end up with a consistent process. You probably want to end up with a consistent development environment, right? Now, I think there are no two more different development environments than Visual Studio and Xcode. Just to give you one simple example, right? So that's the first one. The second one, things become to start interesting, right? Scalability. You develop your application, you test your application, everything is cool. Then you just let it out in the wild. All of a sudden, you find out that there have been like, I don't know, 500,000 downloads. And all of a sudden you find yourself in a big dilemma. How do I scale my server-side resources? Because I tested and I developed everything on a server. I never imagined that my application is going to be the next Angry Birds, right? So I never imagined I will be that successful. Of course, sometimes this is wishful thinking, right? To have 500,000 downloads of your app. But sometimes it happens. And then the question is, how do I scale? And of course, again, this comes back to the decisions that you have taken on the server side. Because if you decide to go with Windows Azure, for instance, then scaling is rather easy. Provided you have the money, of course, right? But scaling is easy from a technical point of view. But if you develop your application in your data center on a server that has 8 cores and 32 gigs of RAM, and you were thinking this is going to be enough. I remember somebody who said that 684K will be enough forever, right? But if you do that, scaling is going to be a very, very tough job. And you will have problems in achieving the scalability. Now, if we think again back to the old days, right? It sounds rather weird, right? Old days. When you had a problem, you usually had enough time to solve the problem. So if there's a scalability problem in, I don't know, your SAP implementation, right? You have the time to fix it. You have the time to buy some servers or to allocate more resources and to do all sorts of stuff. In the mobile world, it's like, what the heck? This is not responding. Well, yeah, delete. End of story. Dealing with the consumer on mobile devices is a whole different ballgame. It's usually enough to have some glitches, maybe 1, 2, 3 times, and the customer will just drop your application. Guess what? There are hundreds of thousands of applications there just waiting to be installed on every single mobile device. So you can't afford server-side issues with scalability, with performance, with stability. That's again a very, very different game. The third one, as I said, is the part that deals with robustness. Right? Your application has to deal with all sorts of things, with all sorts of situations, with all sorts of workloads, with patterns that never occur in an on-premises line of business applications. From this point of view, you have to be very, very well prepared. And the fourth one is, I think, the most challenging, especially for .NET-based shops. The company that I lead is a .NET-based shop, right? We think we're among the best, but still we are a .NET-based shop. Now, the big question that we had is, how are we going to deal with the learning curve of expanding to other platforms than the traditional Windows platforms, Windows Phone, Windows 8, Windows 7, and the others? And that was a huge question for us. Of course, the options are there, right? You can learn Objective-C, you can learn Java, and when I say you can learn, I mean you have to prepare teams, you have to learn people, you have to invest, and you have to do all of the things, right? You have to learn the architecture of those specific platforms. So let me now talk about our own experience in dealing with all these challenges. And let me be very, very clear about this one. As of September, October last year, our team was a purely .NET-based team with zero experience in developing services and applications for other mobile platforms than Windows Phone. So that means zero experience with iOS, zero experience with Android. Of course, we did have significant experience with Windows Azure, significant experience with the Windows platforms. But the challenge of the learning curve was huge for us. And let me start to talk a little bit about the opportunity. This is one of the largest retail companies in Romania. It has in excess of 400 distributed locations, and it has virtually millions of customers. And the challenge was to develop services and client applications for the customers of this company. And the challenge was addressed, again, to a 100% based .NET shop. So the setup was rather easy. My company, Genisoft, with another company called HDSS, we started with two core objectives. And of course, the first objective was to deliver the solution to the customer, but the second one was to create a platform to enable us to develop rapidly similar applications in the future. So we not only tried to provide a specific solution, but we tried to build a platform. And the goal we set for us is we should do as much as possible, if not everything, with our .NET-based skills. At first, when I was talking to people, they were saying like, dude, you are crazy, right? How do you expect to reuse your Windows Azure experience? How do you expect to reuse your .NET, your C# experience? How do you expect to do that when you have to deal with platforms like iOS, like Android, different notification services, different development languages, and so on? So here's our take to it. We decided to use a couple of technologies that we felt are the key to enable a .NET shop to build strong server-side solutions and cover most of the mobile platforms. Of course, in terms of hosting and in terms of the back-end platform, Windows Azure was the obvious choice. But not because we knew Windows Azure. That was not the number one strong point. But because Windows Azure has a set of technologies that enable you to build robust and scalable service backends for mobile applications. And I'm going to talk about that in more detail. The second choice was to use C# as the development language. We thought, of course, Objective-C is very nice, right? Java, again, very nice, right? But what do we know to do best? What is the language we express ourselves in the best way? Is C#. So let's do it with C#. And hence, we decided to use as our development environment Visual Studio. Again, because we already had all the infrastructure that was necessary, all the setup that was necessary, starting from the backend Team Foundation server to the skills of using Visual Studio, not to mention the licensing part and so on. So we decided to use what we have. And then, of course, came the next question. Good. So you've decided on C#. You've decided on Windows Azure. You've decided on Visual Studio. What next? Now, the next thing was, how do we cover the foreign platforms, right? I mean Android, and I mean iOS. Basically, when you talk about this decision, there are two major approaches that you can take. You can go via the web-based approach, which means there are a lot of frameworks out there that are capable of giving you web-based applications that you can package and deliver on the other mobile platforms. Based on our analysis, there are still issues with the performance of these applications. And what we wanted to do is to give close to native performance for the client apps. And that's where we discovered, back then it was called Mono Touch. Today it's called Xamarin iOS and Xamarin Android. We discovered the technology from Xamarin. They basically enable you to write C# code, which gets compiled natively into iOS apps and into Android apps. But that's not all of it. As of 2 months ago or something like that, they let you do your development almost entirely in Visual Studio. There's one exception yet for iOS. If you want to debug your application, or if you want to edit your UI, you have to have a Mac OS machine that is connected to the network and that is configured to work with your Visual Studio for the debug purposes. That glitch will be eliminated by the end of this year. So you will be able to do your full development process within Visual Studio. And for us, that was a big and very important win. As we speak, we are able to reuse about 80% of our code across the different platforms. And if you ask me, that is a lot. It's a lot. And it's based on real facts, on measurements that we did based on the applications that we are in the process of publishing. Now, there was another interesting issue here. Speaking about back-end services, the functionality itself is one thing, but one thing that our customer requested was, guys, this is a mobile application. We have some core functionality, but we need some way to manage server-side the content that gets pushed into that mobile applications, starting from very simple things like the customer wants to communicate with the company and it has the phone and it can actually send messages to the company expecting responses from there. Or the customer can request a new fidelity card, a new loyalty card, and expects it to get it back and be registered and ready to use. So there are lots of things that you need to do within your organization in order to manage this. But the tough request was, we want this to be a web-based solution. And we want it to work cross-platform, cross-browser. So the next interesting challenge was, okay, what is the default choice today if you talk cross-browser, cross-platform? Is HTML5 and JavaScript. I apologize to all the JavaScript fans out there. I hate JavaScript, right? There are some things that get better, or make JavaScript better, like TypeScript, for instance. But still. So the task was, is there a way for me to use my .NET skills? That sounds like crazy, right? To write HTML5 and JavaScript applications? Well, believe it, there is. There is this nice company called Telerik, which has this nice technology called Kendo UI. And part of Kendo UI is something they call helpers for ASP.NET MVC. The helpers for ASP.NET MVC enable you to describe the result of your interface in server-side code written in .NET and C#, and they spit out HTML5 and JavaScript. It's not yet at the point where it spits all the things that you need, but nevertheless, it's a great way to reuse your existing skills to build a server-side application that ends up being an HTML5 JavaScript application. So we did just that. Now, if you look at this slide, I have to be very, very clear about this. This is our take, right? This is our choice. We are not saying this is the best choice, this is the only choice, or this is how things should be. But for us, for a pure .NET shop with no mobile platform experience other than Windows Phone, it proved to be the best choice. So let me get into a little bit of detail to drill down a little bit on the architecture of the approach. There are a couple of things that were important from our point of view. There are two interaction points for the outside world. The one is the customer's website. Being a customer in the retail space, of course, the website is very important. The way you interact with the website is very important. The other one is the service endpoint, which gets consumed by the mobile devices. In between, we have two major components. The one of them is the one that you see on the left in the middle, is what we call the mobile content management platform, which is the platform that delivers content for the mobile application in addition to the typical content for a retail application, like location, locations, products, loyalty cards, offers, and so on. The thing is, and the one thing that we have learned in time, is that if you want a mobile app to be successful, there has to be a reason for the customer to open it at least once or twice a week. If that particular application is used for just some random things that occur sometime, like when I think about buying the products of that retail company, there's a lower chance that you will be successful with that application. So this is why we're delivering a lot of extra content that makes that interesting. And of course, the other components that you see in the middle on the right side is the e-commerce platform. There's no way you can have a successful mobile application in the retail space if there's no integration with e-commerce. Because most probably that is the future of commerce, right? You will see more and more volumes of sales through these types of channels. So these are the two components, and both of them need to provide content, value, and services to the mobile service and also to the website. Now, if you look at it, there are immediately a few interesting things. The first one was authentication and identity management. And of course, the first take was, we know ASP.NET, right? Right. So there is one thing there, which is the role membership provider, which is the great solution. Might be. But not in the case when you expect about 2 to 3 million customers using this. That's most probably not going to scale. That's the first one. The second one, the IT department of the customer came to us and said, guys, we really don't want to get the burden of handling more accounts than we do. So if we have customers that want to create their own accounts, we don't want to handle them within our application and within our data center landscape. So go figure, find a solution that works outside our data center. And of course, a solution that scales properly outside our data center. They were not really very happy about Facebook accounts. They were not really happy about Twitter accounts, and so on. Because there are some functionalities that we envision for future versions that are simply not available in the claims that are produced by those specific platforms. So the natural decision for us was a little bit of Windows Azure that is called Windows Azure Active Directory Services, which is nothing more and nothing less than your Active Directory in the cloud. So that was one interesting decision that we have taken. Keep in mind, expecting a large number of accounts to be used. Now, the other interesting, if you know a little bit about retail, you know that there's one particular area of retail that is very important. That is the area of offers. You usually have your standard product line, but you boost your sales through offers. Most of the time you want to do very well-targeted offers to small number of customers, carefully chosen, of course, and so on. So for this, there are some functionalities that we found out will need to be integrated with some other line of business apps that are running in the customer's data center. So all of a sudden, we were in the situation where, okay, we will have requests coming in with a certain identity. That identity needs to be federated with the identities that lie inside the organization. So again, Windows Azure Active Directory services proved to be a very, very good choice for that. The second one, the second issue that we had to deal with was push notifications, of course. Because ask any retailer, what they want to do is they want to optimize their costs with communicating with their customers. Of course, sending short messages, SMSs, is one way to do it, but that has a certain cost. Isn't there a different solution that is better? Of course, and that's using push notifications. So the first one we thought about at the beginning was, of course, Windows Azure Mobile Services. Now, Windows Azure Mobile Services is a very, very nice piece of technology. It enables you to do many of the things that you usually need to do for a mobile application. But it has one important limitation. It does not support mass push notifications. So if you want to send push notifications to 1 million of your customers, don't expect Windows Azure Mobile Services to be able to handle that, because it was not designed to handle that. Turns out there is a piece of technology where some industry icons, like Clemens Foster's, right, are working on for quite some years. That piece of technology is called Service Bus, right? Now, Service Bus, as the name implies, is a bus for services, right? In other words, it is a bus that can handle large amounts of messages and deliver them to as many consumers as needed. Now, the one thing that is important here is that the Service Bus team has released a technology called Windows Azure Service Bus Notification Hubs. Service Bus Notification Hubs is the way to go in Windows Azure if you want to support massive and scalable push notifications for your applications. And that's because it uses the underlying Service Bus technology, and it integrates all the different technologies for push notifications from the different platforms. It knows how to talk to the iOS notification center. It knows how to talk to the Android notification center. It knows how to talk to Windows Phone notification center, to Windows 8 notification center. So that was the second important choice that we made in terms of the architecture of the application. So basically, since our time is getting to an end, and I would like to reserve some time for questions, basically, just to do a very short recap, today's world has changed significantly. Today's world is not anymore about one or two platforms, about one or two architectural approaches, about one or two technologies. Basically, the choices that we have are exponential in number. The requirements that we have is to cover as many as possible of all these different platforms. So, for a pure .NET shop, like we are, there were a couple of interesting challenges, just to summarize. Develop apps for Windows Phone, for iOS, for Android, using C# and Visual Studio. Develop web applications based on HTML5 and JavaScript, using C# and Visual Studio, if possible, and provide a reliable back-end service or set of services that at a minimum will support, of course, data management, will support authentication and identity management, and will support push notifications. Turns out, if you build everything around Windows Azure, and you use a couple of extra technologies like Xamarin iOS and Xamarin Android, and can do UI from Telerik, for example. Turns out that even if you are a .NET shop with no previous experience on the other platforms, you can make it, you can do it. And that tells a lot about the power, the flexibility, and the versatility of the Microsoft application platform. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. I hope there were at least some interesting things that I've talked about today. I think we have a couple of minutes left. There's a big 5 there, so it means we have 5 minutes left for questions. Yes, sir, please.
Okay, so one of the things with the cloud is if you embrace scalability with something like a mobile service, then you might end up having a huge amount of connected clients passed over to your data center. So my question is, did the data center behind, which seems to be a private cloud sort of environment, did that behave like a private cloud, or was it a block to scalability in that, was it able to be scalable in its own hybrid sort of private space?
That's an excellent question. Add to all the things that I've told you, the customer, I think around mid-2012, said to us very clearly, there's going to be no cloud business in this. Guys, no funky business. We don't like cloud. We don't trust cloud. Right? So then we were sort of in like a dilemma. We knew clearly that the way to achieve proper scalability and robustness is to do it that way. So what we did is we started with V1, version 1, on premises. So that was not a private cloud per se, but it was a solution that resembles a private cloud with load balancers and stuff like that. Right? So that we prepared for that. And then we started to highlight some of the advantages of using stuff from the cloud. The one thing that was very interesting was, so we now have the service, right? It's very important to be scalable, it's very important to and so on. How do we measure that? Turns out, if you want to measure the availability of something, you'd rather not measure the availability from the inside. Because most probably we will get 100% availability. So guess what we thought? What if there is a worker role in a certain cloud, let's say Windows Azure, that monitors our REST endpoints and calculates some metrics about performance and about availability and raises some notifications if things are not properly done. So that was the first step. The other thing, and I'm going again back to the flexibility of the .NET based platform, if you have a solution based on ASP.NET MVC like we had, turns out that moving it into the cloud is a much simpler task than it sounds, right? So we basically created everything in a semi-private cloud approach, but having always in mind that we will end up in a cloud. So that's how we approach that. That was also a very interesting story about relating to a customer that does not trust the cloud, that is not really willing to do it unless you are able to show those parts of the cloud which can help the customer get better business value from those services.
Eventually that diagram is not accurate right now, right?
No, it is accurate. It is accurate because in V1, the back-end service is running on premises, right? But there's already a decision for V2, it's going to run in the cloud.
So you have a roadmap which gets everything in the cloud?
Yes, yes. Well, not everything. Here's another interesting one. You got me started. Turns out that there are some pieces of data that the customer will never want to move into the cloud. there are some things that they never want to move into the cloud. They say, this is core business for us. We don't want that data to be moved into the cloud. So SQL Azure for these pieces of data is out of the question. And you can't argue with that, right? Now, the interesting thing is that Windows Azure has some very little interesting things which are called roles, right, with large memory. So the thing is, what if I can be in a position where that particular piece of data is loaded only into memory? And of course, there is another very nice feature of Windows Azure where you can create a virtual network that makes your machines in the cloud looks like they're in your own network, right? So it turns out there's an interesting solution for doing some massive caching of data in the memory of the worker roles. Turns out that this data which they feel that is very important, they don't want to store it in the cloud, is rather static data. It's about prices, it's about products, it's about stuff like that, which don't change every second, right? So it makes a lot of sense to do that. So we combine this approach with a technique that we used to anonymize the data that was really, really sensitive from this point of view. And we managed to move that also into the cloud. So eventually, data won't be stored in the cloud, but will be served from the cloud, right? And this reminds me from another interesting solution we worked, I think, 2 years ago, where there was a company that needed something like handling tens of thousands of requests per second, or something like that. Caching data into memory was also a very interesting solution for that. Okay, any other questions? Yes, please.
So if you were to compare application path with mobile services, what would be your opinion?
First of all, mobile services serves a lot more purposes than notification hubs, because in mobile services you can also have tables, you can also have different pieces of code that react to things that happen in the tables, and so on. So there's an immediate use for that is handling some device identifiers and stuff like that, right? So mobile services serves a lot more purposes than notification hubs. There's one area where notification hubs is specifically designed, and that is push notifications. With mobile services, you can send push notifications, but you can send them to a rather limited number of devices or groups of devices. If you need to scale to millions of devices, then, well, I think you can make it work in mobile services, but it might take a lot of time to push those notifications, and it might take a lot of time to interpret the results of those pushes. One big issue that you have with push notifications in general is that you have to take into account devices that are not available anymore, meaning they don't have your application installed anymore. If you work with large numbers, like hundreds of thousands or millions, the number of these devices can be significant. You don't want to keep up sending notifications into the dark to devices that don't have the application installed anymore. So that's another thing where the service bus notification hubs is highly optimized. So look at it, it's not a competitor for mobile services. It's not even a replacement for mobile services. It just gives you one particular set of functionality, sending mass push notifications, and it does it in a very, very good way. So if you're limited to a smaller number of push notifications which you want to send at once, mobile services is probably the way to go. If you want to scale that up, you would probably want to rely on the service bus notification hubs. This is how I see it. And that's how it's actually positioned as technology. Okay, I think our time's up. So once again, oh, sorry.
Does notification hub is still using Google's and Apple's communication service?
Of course, of course. So behind the scenes, it integrates with, for that matter, this is what mobile services does also.
Given that we use those services, is there any risk that Google considers that you are spamming or Apple?
Well, not really. Not really. This is a business model that is already established. Windows Azure is not the first to do this. There are other providers that do this. There's a business model that integrates that. It's a business-to-business thing between Google and the provider and Apple and the provider and so on. So from a business perspective, there's no risk associated to be considered a spammer because it will integrate with that. But,
Paid, right?
sorry?
And it's a paid service.
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. So right now, the notification hubs is not yet a live service, meaning you can use it, but there are some things that will be added. There is a certain number of push notifications that you can send for free. Once you exceed that number, once the service gets live, you will have a certain payment plan and a certain charge that you will be charged. There's no disclosure at the moment yet about the final pricing plan. And as we speak today, the functionality for integrating with the Google Notification Center is not yet 100% completed. It is expected, as I understand, to be released during this summer. But again, there's no official position from Microsoft on that. We'll have to see. Oh, yeah.
Okay, so slight question. Yesterday, there was a big announcement from the Service Bus team, which was that AMQP is now supported. That is an amazing thing, and it means we can pass messages between queues without any lifting at all. Can we do anything to Service Bus notification hubs from our queues that we otherwise write to? Can we do queue-to-queue messaging to a notification hub?
As a matter of fact, yes. As a matter of fact, yes. And this is one thing in the light of that is a huge announcement. It might be like a side note or something, but getting that type of support in Service Hub, I think, it opens the door to some exceptional scenarios. But the other important thing is, and here's why we were very happy with our decision to stick to C#, for instance, right? There's a client library for Service Bus that you can download and use in your applications. Guess what? It's a REST client library. Turns out, and we're in the progress of trying that. The announcement was made yesterday. I have a couple of my guys working already on that. We just want to see if from our platform, from the mobile platform, we can use that client library to talk directly to Service Bus. That will open some interesting options for the mobile apps. Okay, guys, so thank you again very, very much. I hope you had an enjoyable session, and I wish you a very nice afternoon, and I hope you had a great time at ITCamp. Thank you very much again.